everyone's work over these last 10 weeks. I'm extremely excited to see how many people are able to turn in their assignments and get such great looking results. I think, pretty much everyone that was working really hard on their scenes have something that is right there to be a really great portfolio piece. Now, of course, as I mentioned in most of your feedback sessions for this week, just this being the final 10th week of our session here does not mean internet connection is unstable. Well, that's never a good sign. Hopefully this doesn't crash. I've never actually seen that pop up in Zoom before. So at least Zoom just said my internet connection is a little unstable. So if the meeting does crash, I just want to let you know that I will ideally restart it as quickly as possible. So hopefully we'll be able to get back up and running in case that happens. But like I was saying, especially during your individual feedbacks, 10 weeks, not a lot of time to make an environment. So don't feel like the kind of screenshots, rendering things out for your portfolio is the time when you're like, okay, now I'm done. I can't work on this and I need to put it away. Constantly kind of edit it, update it. You can spend, weeks, months, even a year, but that's probably quite a large amount of time, kind of updating, editing, polishing your scenes to get to the point where you are really happy with it. Eventually, we all get to this point in our environments that we're building or our assets, characters, what have you, where we just have to pretty much place the scene down. We have to be like, okay, I'm done with the scene. I'm moving on. I'm going to move on to the next project. Because if you just get to that point where you're just kind of noodling around, kind of messing around with small little details, kind of being like, oh, I'm just going to move, maybe some more grass here. Maybe I'm going to make, one more plant. And then you're just not really making a lot of significant changes. You're like, okay, well, maybe if I move this rock pile here, the scene will be better. Or maybe if it is better here. Then you get stuck in this, slight changes, and you are just no longer kind of really learning as much because when you do start a new scene and you do start from scratch and you have to blue sky again, create new assets, or just start assembling a new world, then you're going to get into a lot more topics that you might not be exposed to on a scene that you've just been constantly working on over and over again. Obviously, in a production environment, you are going to be working on any kind of game for, potentially a handful of years. But on a personal project, obviously this is something that you are just making to grow your artistic talent, your experience, and you want to have as many of those experiences as possible. So eventually you'll have to get to that point where you have to decide like, okay, this is good enough. Even if it's not up to, let's say, the industry quality bar that you're trying to hit, the next project will help you get closer to that mark. Because that is, of course, our goal for everyone is to get work that when you look at it and you look at, kind of what you submitted and everything, you're like, okay, I want to get, my scenes up to an industry quality where it looks like, if I look at this scene, it looks like something I would see in an actual game. Because when your work is up to that quality, then it becomes extremely beneficial for you and studios to be like, okay, this person can just jump into the team right away. And that's what you really want to promote yourself as an artist, is that someone who can just kind of jump into the team right away. They don't need as much ramp up or learning time. So being able to show off your skill set, being able to have a nice, diverse portfolio is really what will help you out. Just so we mention it in the live Q&A in case anyone else isn't here and they do want some answers on this. So River's having an issue where he's kind of getting this fatal error in Unreal. And so generally, unless you are kind of like someone who works with Unreal quite a lot and understands what a lot of these crash logs are, my suggestion is to go to the Unreal Engine forums. It's just forums.unreal engine, and kind of just make a post in there, kind of describing what issue you're having. There's a ton of great information here. Like I browse the forums here all the time, looking for new kind of things that people are doing in the engine. If I am having any issues, any kind of like shader issues or kind of issues where, I'm like, oh, well, I expect this to work, but it's not what could be wrong. So, I'll definitely browse these forums a lot. They're, a really great thing. You can see people posting things that could be really beneficial for you. You're like, oh, maybe I want to do whatever this person is doing with their grass and this 22 feet thing. So it can give you a lot of really nice information to kind of just see what's going on, what else you can kind of work with. And if you are having those issues, this is a great place to go there and be like, hey, I'm getting this fatal error crash. This is like the message that's happening. And then they can hopefully be able to help you out, because generally, unless you're a really technical savvy person in Unreal, like looking at file, build, U4 sync engine, all this stuff, you're like, okay, I have no idea what this error message means, like what this error code is. But someone that is working more with Unreal generally can hopefully point you in that right direction. All right, so we'll jump into some questions. Right now there wasn't many left here, so we'll just go through like River's questions here. And then we will obviously just cover some other just general topics. And if you have any questions here, obviously in the live chat, don't hesitate to ask them as we go. So River was asking, his questions here are about kind of like lighting and some of the build time issues that he is having. And so I got an email about, some of these questions as well from another student, because they were saying they're essentially having their lighting set to things like production quality. I believe River mentions that as well. Yeah, it was has it set to the production quality. So if we check out when we're doing like a build, like a lighting build, so we have these four lighting scenarios that you can be building your lighting at. You've got preview, medium, high, and production. So production is used for studios that are actually in production. I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's the highest one. I want to even render my scenes out like that because it's going to look the best. The problem is it takes an exorbitant amount of time. Like I think these go up in build times like by a quantity of 3, I think it is. So like preview, if it took like, let's say 10 minutes, then medium I think would take 30. I think high would then take 90, and production would take whatever the multiple of that would be. So essentially it's just exponentially growing bigger and bigger. So you really probably only want to ever set your environments to high. Like I can't remember actually building on production on anything that wasn't like an extremely small level. And, like this, I think is, even then this is a pretty, large scene. It's going to take quite a while to do that. And so another thing that you'll want to remember is that when you are building these levels in kind of like a production setting, it's usually the engine is kind of built to send these lighting bakes when they are set to a production. It's assuming that you're sending it off to a farm and for that to build. And so if you don't know what that is, like a farm is essentially a server bank of computers that is essentially the entire computer's job is to just run jobs on it, like bake lighting. Like the computer can't actually like build like you can't run around the scene. There's no monitor for it. It's basically just kind of like hard drives. And they're just doing all this processing and computational power on these servers. So there's really no interface with these servers. You're just basically sending your lighting job to one of these servers. And it's like, okay, the server is going to do all of the lighting in the back end for you. And then when it's done, it spits out your result. So pretty much any studio you'll ever go to has this. They're going to have, obviously server rooms that are doing all of these hard computational jobs on the servers so it doesn't bog down your computer. So like, for example, at Naughty Dog, when we're building a level, I'll build the level in in Maya because we just build everything in Maya. And when I want to essentially, I guess what we refer to as build the level, where we're essentially taking the level and sending it to the PS4, or in this case, in Unreal, the build of the level, the lighting build, we're sending that off to our farm. So I can still work on my computer. It's not bogged down. It's not saying like, oh, building, compiling shaders or anything like that. I don't have to worry about that because I send it off to the server farm at our studio. And just to give you a little bit of context in terms of like lighting builds. So lighting builds at Naughty Dog can range, depending on the level, between 2 and 12 hours. And so obviously our builds for lighting are obviously set to a production quality because we are, in a production building things. We need to make sure that they are at the production settings every time we're building and kind of getting those lighting things. But you can see how unbelievably long lighting can take, and our levels can range from either really big or really small. On some of the Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy levels I was working on, the bakes were taking around 18 hours. So essentially I would have to bake the level, have all the lighting being calculated, and I couldn't touch the level at all because if I made any changes, it would break the lighting, and then you'd have to start the whole process all over again. So that's why production lighting takes so long to do. I would definitely recommend setting it to high. Another thing a lot of people kind of just forget, or that increases the build times on things that they're working on exponentially even more, is if you have your foliage set to light map instead of just being dynamically lit. So, of course, if our foliage is light mapped, it's going to have to build the light maps, bake all the lighting in for that little grass patch. However, on this grass, we can see that this is dynamically lit. It has some movement to it, so the lighting slightly adjusts and slightly changes. So we really don't want to actually have light maps baked on there. Things we want light maps on are surfaces like the ground, like buildings, like rocks, like these teepees, things that are going to get some nice soft lighting kind of baked in there. If we turn on our lighting mode, and my terrain still disappears, not sure what that is, although I guess it's kind of here. I think you can see some points, super small points. Not sure what that is. That's a weird bug. Either way, or I guess we can see some of it. We just can't see the high res. But we can see here in the background where we're getting these light map essentially bakes in there. That's where we want light maps to be baked, because it's essentially creating shadows where any of those rocks are. And it's going to give some of that nice effect that the light is spilling between the rock, intersecting with the ground. Whereas, the foliage, you're definitely not going to get anywhere near as much kind of lighting detail out of these little things of grass, especially if they do have any type of movement. So you always want to make sure those are set to the set to dynamic. So, where you can have any, if your just light source in general is set to movable, then you're fine. You don't need to even worry about baking the lighting because everything isn't going to have light maps. But if you have your lighting set to like stationary or static, then you're going to want to have your assets set to either stationary or to movable. So on like the grass, you'd want that to be movable. On things like rocks, these teepees and everything, you're going to want those to be static. Because otherwise it's going to have to bake light maps for all of those little grass blades, and that most likely will take forever. And there's a good chance it could even just crash your lighting, because it has to calculate what the lighting looks like. And for small objects, it takes so much time because it's calculating everything that's around it and it's bouncing that light to that object, and then it's having to essentially create that texture as well. This will also just explode your texture memory for your scene, because each one of these little patches of grass is going to get a little light map for it. And of course, your light maps count towards your entire texture budget for your scene. So if you have all of the grass lit with light maps, then you are basically sacrificing a ton of your texture memory. And I think for lighting, our light maps for an entire level was just a single 8K texture. So you can just imagine that if all of these little patches of grass had a light map for them, that is, and we can see, maybe there's like a ton of grass in here, that's eating up a ton of your light map space that could be saved for like maybe these cliffs or these trees or these teepees. Because trees, I think, get a much better or they get more bang for your buck in terms of light maps, because especially if they have like a lot of overhangs and they have these little dark pockets and shadows. Again, this is depending on the trees. We did constant tests in-house of what trees looked nice with light maps and which ones didn't. And so if they were kind of large, substantial trees, we would use light maps. If they were small, like little bushes, like these little trees here, we would just use kind of the dynamic lights. And so like any of these like little ferns, little flowers, small plants, basically I think it was anything that was in terms of foliage shorter or player height and below was dynamically lit, and anything bigger than that was given some light maps. And you would have to make that balance. If you had a ton of trees in your scene, like there was just massive numbers of it, then you'd have to decide, okay, well, I can't afford to have these trees light mapped, even if they look better. We're gonna have to have them all dynamic. So Clarence asked, was Uncharted using dynamic lights for the scenes? So kind of, yes. Essentially like every environment you're ever gonna make is always gonna have at least one essentially dynamic light on at all times for the most part. And that's always going to be like the sun. So you could have like other lights in here that are dynamic that are like floating around. So like you can imagine any of the flashlights Drake would hold, that's always a dynamic light. But the sun is always dynamic. However, we would bake light maps for basically everything except of course the foliage. So let's just grab some ArtStation real quick. All right, so on something like this, like a scene like this, like all of these rocks, all these buildings, these larger trees, they're all light mapped. Actually, this is a terrible image to use. Let me use one that's a little closer with smaller details on it. All right, so this one's pretty good. All right, so everything in essentially this cave here is light mapped except for the foliage. Now, of course, that can lead to the occasional issue where you get one little piece of foliage that either doesn't light correctly or doesn't light really nicely. However, it saves you significantly in terms of your light maps. So we can see all the foliage here looks really great. Even the stuff that's bathed in the light here, all this ivy, all this stuff works really great. You can't really tell that it's being dynamically lit by the sun, and that's it. It's not getting any kind of light maps baked for it. The only times is that when you get that one little asset that doesn't light really well. And we can see over here on the left here, like this one little patch of grass, for some reason, it's just not lighting as nicely as the others. And so, that's one of those things where you either are gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna have to leave it in here or I'm gonna have to get rid of it. It also looks like it's mipping pretty badly too. So that could just be loading reasons or whatever, but essentially, you do stand the chance to get maybe one or two little errors. However, this amount of significant savings you're going to be getting far outweighs, one little patch of grass being a little bit lighter green than the others. Even like these little rocks here, they're being lit dynamically, like they don't have light maps baked for them, because a lot of engines nowadays just support essentially runtime ambient occlusion. So if you have like a pile of rocks or like a big rock and they're intersecting with other objects and you have them all runtime lit, they'll create some slight little shadows in between where things are intersecting, even with the ground. So that can always really kind of just help out. And most engines kind of just support that by default. So long story short, yeah, definitely you want to keep your foliage for the most part just set to dynamically lit or movable for those assets. Like if you select an object, you want to have that movable. That's only if you are kind of baking your sun at a static or stationary position. If your light is set to movable, then you don't have to worry about it because you can essentially rotate your sun around. And if you did this and you had light maps being baked, then of course it would ruin, those light maps. But when it's set to kind of movable, then you can get, you can obviously move it around. Of course, you're not going to get as nice of lighting in terms of, kind of some of the softer shadows where things are intersecting. However, I think for exterior environments, you're never really going to notice the kind of differences in that. I think the subtle nuances that you get in terms of interior corridors and any kind of caves or houses, buildings that are going to have a lot of bounce light in them, then you're going to notice the benefit of light maps significantly more. For things like this, having this entire scene, the difference between this being light mapped and not light mapped is really not that big. Obviously, having light maps would be great, but the ability to kind of change the lighting, the time of day, really helps out. And then you can just look at games like Red Dead Redemption. That game has a full dynamic 24-hour lighting cycle. They only kind of bake light maps when you're inside a building. And then they have tech that will essentially modulate between different light maps, where it'll blend from a light map of the scene kind of built in the day and then at night when they have like their night lighting in there. So that's like a really technical thing that you need a technical artist to set up, but that's just how things are kind of done. All right, River was also asking about, for portfolios, should we focus more on production of outdoor environments during the daytime, and is night more suitable to express the indoor scenes? So no, not at all. There are some fantastic environments being built in night scenes or in heavy fog or in extreme weather cases. Now, it might be easier for you to build things in kind of a neutral lighting setting, like, where it's like, oh, it's more of a clear, nice blue day. It might be a lot easier to kind of build your scene that way, kind of hone in your materials, make sure everything looks really nice, because it's generally easier to edit materials in kind of a bright blue day, just because you know exactly what those materials are supposed to look like. Whereas at night, it could be a little bit more difficult. So you can kind of really balance your shaders better in terms in like daylight settings. But I wouldn't just be like, oh yeah, outdoor environments should always be in the day and indoor environments should always be at night. Not at all. Like at work right now, I'm working on a level that essentially has 5 lighting conditions. Essentially, you see it at 5 different points, and it has different lighting conditions for all of it. It has one that is a nice blue, bright, sunny day, one that it has a heavy rain, kind of torrential downpour on it, one that is super just kind of fogged out, one that is a little bit snowy, and then one that is at like just pitch black night. And so those all range at different times of day, not just in terms of weather as well. So don't limit yourself to just being like, oh, I just want to have my environments for outdoor scenes to just be kind of like, nice bluebird sky settings. And then you don't want to limit your interior environments to just be, oh, well, it's nighttime, so I can put candles and everything. Yeah, having like lights and candles in there can provide a lot of really nice bounce light, but some fantastic work I think you could see even in like the original Last of Us, like all of those scenes or a lot of those environments were built without kind of like the use of exterior lights, such as like candles or flames or lighting fixtures, because, in a post-apocalyptic world like that, you don't have lights. For the most part, people living there, they just don't have lights. So you have to kind of really figure out how you want to light your environment to have that kind of cool ambiance, that cool setting, that cool effect that you want to go for without the use of, say, like a lighting fixture. So if you're going to do that in the day, you get a lot of really nice bounce light, a lot of kind of just more subtle kind of tones in the lighting. So a great example would be from just Children of Man, which was obviously a huge inspiration for all of The Last of Us. But you can kind of see like some of these like interior shots. Let me see if we can find any that are in some of the buildings. So stuff like this. Like this is an interior building. It's in the day, and you can just see how much mood and atmosphere you're getting from just the light outside the windows kind of bleeding into this environment. You're still getting a lot of nice specular response on the floors here that are clearly wet and full of a bunch of leaves and gunk. So definitely don't limit yourself to just creating interior environments at night because you're like, oh, well, I can put a bunch of lighting fixtures. Stuff like this is stuff that, of course, we'd love to see. However, of course, if you are really focusing in on a lot of the lighting aspects, a lot of studios, again, they kind of break up the positions where they'll have environment artists and then they'll also have lighting artists. Some studios do, even AAA studios, they'll have you do lighting work. Like I think Sony Santa Monica, their environment artists predominantly light their own levels, but at say like Naughty Dog or like the Battlefield team, the environment artists build the level, and then we have lighting artists. So does like the Battlefield team, where the lighting artist just really specializes in lighting, making sure that the levels look really great with the lighting provided. And so you have to work with them on the team to kind of just get that nice cohesion between lighting and materials, as well as kind of building out a really nice scene. So yeah, again, for figuring out lighting, one of the things that a lot of environment artists use, obviously, is a lot of photo reference and a lot of kind of photography reference for kind of what we're going for in terms of like mood for our lighting. And that's, obviously, kind of reference just applies to really anything, but utilizing photo reference to kind of really match your lighting, I think, is really key if you want to kind of push the lighting in any of your environments to kind of either that like filmic quality or into that kind of like professional photographer quality. Take a look at what photos inspire you and be like, okay, how can I kind of really recreate this light in my environment? Like if you wanted to do something, let's go New Zealand. No, that's not what we want. Let's do environment. No, let's do landscape. New Zealand, landscape photography. So let's say you're doing an environment kind of like in New Zealand or something, and you're like, oh, I love this mood, this lighting. This is something I want to have in my environment. Utilize reference like this and figure out what is helping make the lighting look like this. We're getting a lot of cool blues in these shadows. We're getting, some hyper kind of like oranges, magentas, pinks, yellows in the sky, and it's bouncing off a lot of kind of like the glaciers and the lakes. So kind of working with that to kind of get your lighting to really match a lot of these scenes. And then of course, the reverse can be true if you're like, oh, okay, I like this more, just find a good one. Like if you were like, oh yeah, I really just want this kind of more bluebird kind of sky thing, then just go for something like this, kind of try and figure out what is going on in this kind of lighting condition to allow you to have that. Clarence asks, I noticed the environment artists at Naughty Dog are somehow like the technical artists too, because they are quite technical in the shader. Yes, so a lot of our shader artists, I would say, become more technical. But even then, like we have a bunch of people, I would say we have a handful of texture artists at Naughty Dog who are like a small handful who are extremely good at building shaders. They're really kind of just technical savvy, or they've been working with the kind of our shaders for so long, they just know a lot of tricks and how to get a lot out of it. But then we also have people who really don't do very well in kind of shaders. And so we have basically kind of a much more easy to use shader setup than what you have kind of here in Unreal, because in Unreal, it gives you the power to build really whatever. So you can kind of come in here, build whatever shader you could ever really imagine if you know how to do it. However, a lot of people like at Naughty Dog don't know how to build, like for example, this is the rock with the snow and the kind of like unique normal map and the detailed normal map texture that we showed off in class. A lot of people at Naughty Dog would have no idea how to actually build one of these shaders. So there are some people who are more technical savvy and they know how to build it. And so we have a system where essentially all you have to do, and how most people see the shaders, is they see the kind of instance list. They see kind of all of these options that they have access to, all these areas they can add their textures into. They'll add their textures in there, and then they adjust all of kind of like these values to get their assets to look really good. So they don't really know how to build the shader in this fashion. They just know how to kind of really work the shaders well with all the parameters that they're given. And then of course, the more you use any kind of tool, the better you're going to get at it, and the more you're going to know what kind of tips and tricks you can really do. So they start to become very well aware of the things that they want to be able to do and kind of pull off in the shaders that we have. And those help some of the shader artists, just make absolutely amazing shaders. And of course, at any studio, you're going to have technical artists where you're like, hey, I want to be able to do, let's say, glass. And, I really want to do this kind of cool refracted glass where it looks like, maybe you're kind of checking out like a rainy window or something. And you're like, oh, cool, I really want to have, something like this. Light is just kind of getting all kind of to field it out. We're getting a lot of streaks down it, but you're like, but I don't know how to do that. We'll have the technical artists be like, oh, cool, I can actually make a kind of rainy shader parameter, much like our parameters here, and they can add that into basically our core shader. And so, you work with a technical artist, you're like, I want this feature. This is what I'm expecting to happen. And then they can go in, add it into our kind of like master shader, which is more like this. This is what our technical artists probably would see, something more like this. And this is what most of our actual just texture artists, our shader artists at Naughty Dog kind of see and kind of really play with. And also, some people, again, as soon as they start working with it, then they're like, oh, this is really cool. And then they figure out different ways to really do things. That can really just help you shine as a individual at any studio you really go to. If it's something that you're like really passionate about, you're like, oh, I really want to dive into this, then it can make your work just stand out, because you're like, oh, well, I'm able to kind of achieve a lot more in not only in terms of quality, but also performance than possibly some other people who maybe just are like, well, I know how to make it look really cool, but I don't know how to make it run very well. So that can just kind of really help make you a better shader artist, if that is something you're like, I really want to like go into that, kind of just figuring out how to work more with different types of shaders, how to break them down, and then working as much as you can with a technical artist when you are on a team. The more you work with them, the more they will kind of just be more inclined to kind of work with you and figure things out and give you any of the information. Clarence mentioned, yeah, because he was asking about it because he really liked the kind of setup from the course and found it very useful. Definitely glad you found it useful, because, yeah, I think understanding how shaders are built, even one that is pretty technical like this. However, if you open up any Unreal shader, they are probably 5 times more kind of like technical, and they have things going on that you're looking at and you're like, I have no idea what this is doing or how it's doing this. Their shaders are insanely technical, because again, you can kind of make anything. And the way you build shaders in Unreal, you can kind of do it more than one way. And so, that's just the really nice power. But having a good understanding of how they're built, from what I've seen, generally helps you when you get to a position where you're like, hey, technical artist, I really need to do this thing. I know I can do it. I know kind of what it's supposed to be doing. Like I kind of know like, oh, okay, I need some kind of maybe a unique normal map strength multiplier. I need to kind of be able to just max out maybe just my red and green channel. You're like, I kind of know I need to do that, but how do I build it in terms of this kind of like spider web? You're like, I don't know how to do that. And that's where they can kind of come in and help out. So when you have that knowledge of how shaders are kind of built, and just kind of the thought process behind it, I always feel like it really helps out when you get into that production environment and you're like, okay, cool. This is what I want to build. How can you help me kind of build it? Or when you're kind of working with these parameters, you're like, you know what? If I kind of maybe change up some of these parameters, I can get some other cool effects. And so I know a lot of the shader artists at Naughty Dog also work in Unreal because it is really easy to just build cool shaders that, they might want to even demo off to the technical artists at work and be like, hey, I can do this in Unreal. How can we get this? How can this be a thing that we get at Naughty Dog? And so the tech art team might be like, oh, well, that's really cool. It's a really great way to do that. Or they might be like, oh, we already have a way that you can do that, but it's like maybe more convoluted. And then they might kind of work with you to kind of build something that's a little bit more useful. All right, so River had a question. It's going to take me a little bit to read. So he applied for an environment texture artist for the temporary assignment for Naughty Dog. He got a reply from the recruiting officer at Naughty Dog. She said the job opened in April. Unfortunately, your class is in May 20th at university. You really hope you can get a job to like make an interview. So is Naughty Dog often recruiting people for recent graduates? Is there a chance to enter Naughty Dog? What does it mean for a temporary assignment? What does that means? Just the job is just for a few months. And for an environment texture artist, the workers just focus in on environment textures used by Substance Designer Painter. In order to get the job, do I need to focus in on study textures? All right, so that's like a lot of questions. So I will just kind of break it down as we kind of go through this. So if we go to Naughty Dog Careers and we just open up the job page that we have here, that kind of like lists essentially everything that, obviously we're hiring for. And you can see a lot of things just say temporary assignment. So what does it mean for a temporary assignment? A temporary assignment means you are going to be hired as a contractor. Your position is only for a set amount of months. And then once those months are over, your contract could maybe be extended. You could potentially be hired as a full-time, but generally you are your contract is over. And so then you're just obviously no longer working at the studio. Whereas like a full-time artist, if they're hired as full-time and then the studio no longer has a need for that person and they're like, oh, we have too many people now, then that's when you run into seeing all those like mass layoffs at a lot of studios. So every studio hires temporary assignment people, temporary assignment or contractors, especially when you're kind of going into crunch / full-on production, because you need as many people to really work on a game as possible. And once the game is over, you don't need as many people as possible. You want to go back down to whatever your main kind of regular pre-production or early production team's at. And obviously studios don't want to just fire people because it's a lot harder to hire people full-time. It's a lot harder to fire people that are full-time. So they hire them on contracts. And it just allows the studio to kind of evaluate the artists and kind of figure out like, oh, is this someone who would work well at the studio? And then, there is the chance that you could get hired full-time, and there is a chance that you would just be, your contract would be over. So yes, we obviously are hiring a lot of kind of temporary just contract artists as well as, animators, designers as well. It's just something that pretty much every studio really does. Now for The environment texture artists, what's kind of, I guess, the difference between environment artists and then environment texture artists. So for Naughty Dog, we split up the environment art position essentially in two. So like for my role at Naughty Dog, like I'm an environment artist, and the person I work with is an environment texture artist. So the texture artist is making textures, they're making shaders, they're doing UVs, and they're doing a lot of vertex blending, like we did with our kind of like our rock assets, where you're painting a lot, you're painting the terrain, you're essentially giving color to the environment. Whereas what I'm primarily doing is I'm working with the level designers, I'm building the assets, I'm kind of creating the rocks, the buildings, I'm set dressing the entire area, I'm figuring out where we're going to place all of the buildings, where the trees, like essentially, like if you look at a scene kind of like in just lighting only, essentially that's predominantly what I usually look at during the day, is just kind of just a bunch of gray meshes and I'm placing all over the place. Obviously you can turn textures on to really see what they're at, but the texture artist is the one who's like, if we have this teepee, for example. So at work, if we're like, okay, cool, we want to make this teepee or whatever, I would go in there in Maya, I would model out the teepee, I would just get everything ready. I would, either make a high poly if need be, or most likely I would outsource a high poly. But if I was like, okay, I'm just going to easily, quickly model something like this, that's what I would do. And then our texture and shader artists would go in there, they would UV this asset, and then they would create whatever textures and shaders you need for this asset. And then I, of course, would go in and place it in the world. Now, most studios don't really do this. Most studios, as an environment artist, you're going to be doing modeling and texturing. That's just how we kind of do things at Naughty Dog, because we want people to really hyper specialize in whatever they're working on, whether it is kind of texture and shader creation, or if it's environment layout, set dressing, and world building. So for the texture position, as kind of the other follow-up question to this was for like the environment texture artist position, are you using Substance Designer or Painter, or like ZBrush and Photoshop? So the skills I would say you need to have for this are obviously like be able to create textures in Photoshop, being able to create textures in ZBrush, sculpting in ZBrush, creating textures in Substance Designer, and then obviously being able to UV. But being able to UV is pretty easy. It's kind of like a little mindless thing that we just have to do. But yeah, Substance Designer is obviously becoming more and more prevalent in the games industry, and we use it quite substantially. There are still a handful of texture artists at Naughty Dog who primarily create their textures in a combination of ZBrush and Photoshop, but I think probably in the next 3 or 4 years, that's really going to start to fall by the wayside. Substance Designer is just so powerful and so fast at any kind of iteration you need to make, that you really want to learn that program and be really proficient at it, because it'll just help you be able to make textures a lot faster than the kind of older ways of making them in ZBrush or in Photoshop. However, there are some things that artists definitely prefer to make in ZBrush or Photoshop, even if it takes slightly longer. Sometimes the results are just far superior for them. So for pretty much all the sculpts that my texture artist did in Uncharted 4 and in The Lost Legacy, all of those were sculpted in ZBrush. And then the base colors were done in Photoshop, I want to say, at least for Uncharted 4. And then in Uncharted The Lost Legacy, it was a combination of the base colors, the roughness maps were kind of a combination of Substance and Photoshop. So it really kind of just ranges. We still have texture artists who create foliage completely in ZBrush. Some of them create it by hand. Some of them create it in Photoshop. It really just depends. But yeah, learning and knowing Substance Designer is extremely powerful. And, of course, it makes your portfolio look a lot better if it is a tool you can learn. I think CGMA has a class on it. The Intro to Environment class kind of just covers how to make 2 basic textures, but it's obviously something that if you want to learn more, like, I think it is a good thing to kind of take a class. I also posted all the free, the free Substance tutorials here in week 3. So you can check those out as well if you want to learn a little bit more. I think some of them are paid for. Maybe it's I think none of them max out at more than $5, but you can definitely check those out as they're super beneficial as well. So that's kind of what the temporary environment artist position is listed. And, if you see that, you'll essentially see that anywhere you're applying. A lot of positions will be for kind of temporary assignments, and often temporary assignments also are for more junior artists, because as especially at Naughty Dog, we rarely hire people that have no actual experience shipping any game files. It's just very difficult if you don't have that production experience, because when you're working on an actual game, the amount of knowledge you gain from even just a few months in a studio, and especially just shipping one project, is exponential to anything you could ever learn on your own. Because, we went over this entire class where we made this environment. Everyone was making their environment, but no one had to work with design. No one had to work with an animation team, an FX team, a sound team, had to kind of optimize their level to make sure it runs in performance. Those are so many things that, there isn't really a class for it. And it really is just dependent on also kind of whatever studio you're working at. But that information that you do learn is really beneficial because, being able to optimize shaders, being able to optimize modeling assets, being able to work with other people, work with other designers, work towards deadlines. Those are things you really only can kind of get on the job. And so that's why for especially full-time positions, I think we've maybe hired 2 environment artists ever that were just out of school. But for temporary positions, you see those at studios. Generally, they are, studios are more lax to hire people on the temporary / contract positions at a lower skill level, because they know that in 9 months or a year or 3 months, however long the contract is for, if they are a terrible employee, well, then they're gone and we don't have to worry about it. Because again, firing people is extremely difficult and very expensive. So most studios never want to fire anyone as it's just not a good look for them. And it's just easier to hire people on as contractors and see how they do. That being said, obviously we are in a big wave of hiring people to kind of ramp up for The Last of Us, as most studios kind of really are starting to ramp up for kind of games that are coming out either at the end of the year, at the start of next year, or even kind of the end of next year, depending on how long the production time is for your game. Usually you don't want to hire contract artists more than 2 years out. I would say that's 1 to 2 years is the kind of general timeline of kind of contract artists. Sometimes they can be shorter. Rarely are they ever longer. I would say most are a year or 2. So we hire a bunch of people, and having a lower skill set, but having kind of a good art background, having a good portfolio that shows off that you do know how to kind of create good art, kind of create an environment that obviously reads really well, how you can kind of create assets that fit into an environment, and the quality work is close to what you see that studio producing, then there's, a really good chance that they'll hire you, even if you don't have a shipped kind of game experience. All right, Clarence, I see you asked a question here. I guess it's kind of privately. I can answer that after just the live Q&A if you want. Yeah, I'll definitely answer it, but I can just answer it after. All right, let's see. What else did I want to go over? Okay, so for portfolios, because obviously, most people, when they are kind of learning or building environments, they're either looking to get their first job or they're trying to essentially sidestep to another job, go from one position they're at to another. They oftentimes run into the issue of, kind of displaying in their portfolio what will really help sell them as an artist. So I already mentioned that is sell them as an artist that is beneficial to the studio hiring them. So I already mentioned that you want to be able to create work that looks like it could fit into any game that studio is making. So obviously, if, for example, you were to apply at Bungie, who is making Destiny, making a bunch of sci-fi stuff, if you are applying with a portfolio that just has hand-painted, stylized fantasy stuff, even if it's the most amazing kind of artwork you're having, you're putting yourself at a major disadvantage because you're applying to a studio that doesn't do that kind of artwork. And we see that all the time. Anyone I've ever talked to, any other studio sees it all the time, where people are applying for positions and they just do the kind of complete opposite style of work. Now, that doesn't mean you have to kind of create, just sci-fi things for your portfolio if you're applying to, kind of like Destiny. But if you don't have anything that is sci-fi in your portfolio, let's say that you've got a bunch of environments because you were making or working on a game, or your environment you're building was a jungle. And you're like, cool, I got all this jungle stuff. I did a great job on it. But you really want to apply there, but you don't have anything sci-fi in your portfolio. Well, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is make something really small, really quickly that is sci-fi, that is in that Destiny kind of vibe and style, and keep it really small, keep it really compact, and then apply. Don't apply before then. Make sure you have something in your portfolio that is slightly geared towards what that studio is doing. And that just generally means, kind of like sci-fi, realistic, fantasy, hand-painted. If you're applying to like The Division and they've got just all this cityscape stuff, and you've got like an environment that has maybe a few pieces of like buildings in it, but it's mostly jungle, then I think that's kind of fine to apply to a studio like that for. But if it's like you don't have anything sci-fi in your environment, then you're going to want to have at least even some props that are kind of a sci-fi nature. Because then it will just show that they'll be like, okay, well, they made this really great jungle environment, but could they make a sci-fi environment? And if you show that you can make a bunch of sci-fi props or a very small sci-fi kind of diorama, then that will kind of really give you a really nice leg up and show them that like, hey, I can do these sci-fi assets in the quality that your studio is doing, but this is the only environment that I had when I'm applying. Because it's unrealistic to think that you would build out a sci-fi environment or build out a different environment every time you are applying to a different studio. Now, that was actually advice I was given when I was a student. They were like, oh yeah, just build a different environment for kind of everyone you're applying to. And, obviously that's ridiculous. And you could never really do that unless you had an immense amount of free time. So having at least, maybe one or two props or a very small little diorama, I think is a great way to do it. Let me see if I can get some 3D, some kind of cool little 3D dioramas. So stuff like this, I think, is always really great, where it's, it's kind of floating, it's off in space. Something like this, it kind of really shows off everything that you'd want to show off in a environment, but you're not having to build out the full thing, but you're showing all of the quality. So like, again, if you were applying to Bungie and you wanted to make something kind of for Destiny, building out a little diorama like this in the style of Destiny is a really great thing and a great way to just show that you have the ability to kind of create assets of that quality that they are looking for. And so when they see it, they're like, oh, okay, this is someone who I know we could hire and they would instantly be able to fit in with the team, and instantly be able to kind of just jump on board and not need too much ramp up time. Because when you are in the heater production for a studio, the worst thing you want is someone that needs a lot of essentially learning time, because oftentimes you just want to hire people to kind of get things done. It's not necessarily hey, let's teach them how to do all these things. It's like, I'm hiring you because we are crunching and we need to get this game done. And some studios are a little more lax on that. Like I know Insomniac has a really great essentially mentorship program within the studio where they kind of help people out who are more new and junior. And I think that's, a great way to do it, especially for kind of getting people into the studio, getting them inundated with all the tools, especially if they are, they could tell that they're a talented artist, but they might just be, pretty new. And then of course there are studios who hate the idea of having newer people because they just want everyone that starts there to be able to kind of work on their own and not need anyone there to essentially be your kind of lead or your boss, because they just expect you to jump into whatever environment you're building, and just kind of go with it and make the entire thing. So for like example, for like Uncharted 3 here, like when I started, they were like, okay, they gave me the concept of essentially kind of like this shot of the environment. And they're like, this is kind of what we want the environment to look like. Build the entire environment, not just this one shot, but everything from this environment. So this was like a horse chase that goes all the way through the desert, and it goes on this giant like cliff kind of chase. And so they basically gave me one concept and they were like, okay, build everything, kind of just go. And, they weren't giving me really any kind of direction. There wasn't like a lead there to kind of like hold my hand along the way. They were like, this is just kind of what we expect. This is the deadline that you have to finish this. And they're like, just figure it out. Because, at least at Naughty Dog, it's more of it's just most people just kind of want to be able to work on their own thing and they don't want to have to kind of teach other people. But there are other studios where you do have more of that nice mentorship thing, which I think is obviously a really great thing to have. I definitely learned a lot from the people that I was working with on Halo Reach, because they just kind of sat around me and they would just kind of help me out there. But when I started at Naughty Dog, it was pretty much just like, nope, just kind of go at it and just start working. They're like, you're either going to make it or you're eventually going to kind of just kind of fail, I guess. That was kind of what they kind of implied to me. So, some studios are like that where they are just more, hey, we're just looking for kind of more senior people. And then if they do want to have like some more junior artists and everything where they're like, all right, we don't want to be as strict, then they'll hire them on as kind of the temporary contract positions. So it depends on whatever studio you are kind of going for. And it is unfortunately kind of hard to know. It kind of just is kind of a guess, as I don't know. Like I didn't know off the bat, like Naughty Dog was kind of, or I guess I did with Naughty Dog, that they're kind of just like, hey, you just have to do all your work yourself and you don't really get much help. But like other studios, I have no idea. I just know that, because I have a bunch of friends, at Insomniac, and I know that they have a really nice mentorship program. Clarence mentioned that he would love to work for one day, but him being a foreigner and not a resident in the U.S., that is an unfortunality. So to dispel that kind of, I guess, myth, we have a extremely high number of foreign individuals working at Naughty Dog, probably more than I would say any other studio in the US. Like the amount of people that we have that are international people is extremely high. Um, like the I think just the difficulty of obviously being someone who is from another country and coming to the U.S. And getting a visa is obviously extremely hard and extremely expensive for that studio, as they essentially have to sponsor your visa. However, I just do want to dispel the notion that it's impossible. It is just very hard. I would say it's more difficult than obviously it would be for a U.S. resident, because the studio knows that, like, oh, with a U.S. resident, they can just move. And if the studio had to even pay for moving expenses, which I would say most don't, or probably half don't, they know that that person could easily just come to wherever they are. With an international artist or designer or anything, obviously they're like, cool, we have to go through this whole visa program, and they are really expensive. I think it's like 10 grand. And, it's kind of like a guessing game if you're actually going to even get the visa. And so a lot of the environment artists like that we've hired had to spend like a year from when they accepted the offer to work at Naughty Dog to actually getting their visa and kind of moving over. However, again, I do want to mention that, like, probably, I want to say maybe a fifth of the entire environment art team is comprised of international people from Mexico, from Spain, from Brazil, Germany, Sweden, Japan, France. Yeah, so pretty much like all over. And then, a good amount of Canadians. But, if you do live in Canada or in Mexico, it is easier because there is a different visa you can get that can allow you to work in the US a lot easier. So, yeah, that is also a benefit for at least people that do live in Canada and the US. But just do want to dispel that notion that if you are an international individual, like, it's not impossible. However, if you are kind of hoping to get a job in the States, you have to kind of really be at the top of your game. And the more things you do that essentially get your name out there, like, if you work on high profile games, if you do any talks, if you do any articles that are written, if you teach anything, like if you teach classes, things at like Gnomon. So just kind of in the future, just think about those things. Like, I would say you have to be pretty well experienced for the ability to get the visa, because generally the US, from what I've been told, like the US looks at the applicant and they're like, okay, this person has to be so good that we couldn't find someone in the US who is just as good, that you have to hire this person from a different country. So that's kind of like the mentality they take. So a lot of the international artists that we have, like, they will kind of, when they are getting ready to apply at Naughty Dog, after they generally do have a one or two at least high profile games under their belt that they've shipped, that they can show to the US government that, like, hey, I've shipped these really important games that have sold a lot of units. And then they'll kind of reach out to like 80.lv or like Gnomon to do kind of like tutorials or write articles, because all of those things look really highly on you as an artist, not just for international people, but also just artists in general. So the more of those things that you can do, write articles, doing breakdowns of your environment, people love to see that. I've had a lot of my students from previous classes make articles here on 80.lv where they are breaking down either things that they've done in the past, things that they did from this class, or things that they do in the future. And so those are always great. They just add to your portfolio. You can kind of show them around. It makes you more marketable and more kind of just seen at in the kind of I don't know what the word I'm looking for. Just more seen in the industry sphere that is the gaming industry, the art sphere that is. The more you get your name out there, the more that studios kind of take notice of you. So doing anything like, creating articles, creating breakdowns, kind of posting enough on social media where you're kind of getting your name there. Those are all extremely beneficial things to you as not only an international artist, but also an artist here in the States. One thing that's been really beneficial for a lot of just myself and other artists in terms of job or just getting really well known is Polycount. So in case you don't know what Polycount is, it's probably one of the best online art forums. It has just kind of like the Splash News page where they just show a bunch of kind of like cool art people are working on, or kind of breakdowns, environments, tutorials, things that are just going on in the industry. But the main kind of thing here are the forums. And there's kind of like two main aspects of the forums here. There is the 3D and 2D video game art where people are posting the art that they're working on. It's essentially kind of like the forums that we had here, except on a much bigger scale. And obviously it's open to everyone. However, the stuff that people are doing here, obviously can get seen by everyone, and you can get critiques by a lot of people. And the one benefit of Polycount is that pretty much every artist that I know, whether they are extremely seasoned vets, they are leads, they've been in the industry forever, or they're kind of students, they're always kind of viewing Polycount. Some will check it every day, some will check it, every, once or twice a month to just kind of see what is kind of going on in the industry, what people are really doing. They'll just kind of check out things. And the kind of connections that you can make with people if you are posting quite a lot, if you're posting a lot of your work here, if you're posting kind of like, not only just like, hey, here's my finished work, but here is where I'm starting for, like, let's say your next environment. You're going to start with your blueprint, and you kind of like post that up. And then as you go, like maybe once a week, like we did with this class, you're going to post up where you're at with that environment. And people will give you critiques. Some people won't. Some people just look at it until the very end. However, when you are posting quite often on this, you're going to get more well known. Your name's going to kind of get out there. People are going to see it. They're going to kind of remember it. And a lot of the people that are frequenting Polycount are people who are working at these studios. And I've had quite a lot of job offers from people that I know on Polycount because they've seen my stuff. And I've also had friends who've had that as well, where they were like, oh yeah, I got my first job because someone I knew from Polycount saw the work that I was working on. And they were like, hey, we're hiring here at BioWare. Are you interested in kind of a job? And so a lot of people definitely, it's a great way to kind of get obviously noticed and just kind of build essentially your own personal brand. That's always, I guess that's kind of like one of the buzzwords for the last like kind of decade and into the future. But it is true. You always are trying to build your own brand. And the more that you can show off your work, the more your name gets recognized, the more kind of like breakdowns and articles that you write, tutorials that you do. Even if it's like a simple tutorial, you're like, oh, hey, this is how I hand paint my textures. Even just kind of showing that in your kind of threads and everything. A lot of people find that extremely beneficial and valuable. So I highly recommend utilizing Polycount and just kind of posting there all the time. So Frank said he has to unfortunately go. Thanks for all the great info. Still tweaking his scene. Goals to post it up in the next week. Yeah, definitely keep me posted on it. Obviously would love to see it. Really cool that you're going to be starting Clinton's class. I know I've seen a bunch of really great scenes come out of there as well. And I think we might have just hired someone who, on a temporary position, who was working on one of Clinton's classes, I think maybe 2 terms ago. So, it can always lead to definitely good things when you're getting just more and more experience out of all of these classes and everything. But yeah, definitely keep in touch with me as well. And that kind of goes obviously for everyone. The CGMA email I have here, you can always reach me. Like I have way less emails in here than I do, like let's say in just my regular email. So these are easier to see if you want to just keep me updated with where you are going in terms of your art progression, your kind of scenes that you're working on, whatever scene you're working on next. Definitely love to see them and give any kind of feedback on them that I can. But just always remember that. Definitely always here. Just because the class ends doesn't mean that, kind of the relationship that we've built over this last 10 weeks has to end at all. Clarence said, someone saw my previous work on ArtStation and they asked me to try out. So yeah, so it definitely is kind of the more public facing you can get your name out there, the more you can kind of show it off on something like Polycount. I believe in the videos I talked about ArtStation and the importance of ArtStation, just getting your name out there more and being able to kind of show off on ArtStation is extremely beneficial for you because obviously artists from all over kind of look at ArtStation. I would say ArtStation is the best place to really have your portfolio just because it's super clean and simple. Because again, you really just want to be showing off your best work. You don't want to have 40 or 50 things kind of on possibly your own personal website. And you're like, oh, check out all my characters and all this stuff. Maybe you want to have that if you want to just kind of keep a nice record of all of your work. But if you want to show off a nice clean portfolio that you can send to artists who are kind of hiring and everything, ArtStation, I think, is one of the best places to go for this. Just keeps things really clean. And then, of course, just the exposure that you can get on here really kind of helps out. A lot of, I would say it's probably the most popular art kind of art site for kind of 3D art and everything. And then Polycount is probably almost just as popular, but obviously being more formed based, it's not as kind of appealing as just kind of looking at a bunch of images. However, of course, showing off works in progress, having the forms to be able to converse and talk with other people, I think is the strong benefit of Polycount, as well as just their technical forms down here. So as I mentioned, the first one is kind of the makeup of art where you're posting art and everything. The technical forums are also an extremely valuable resource. When I started out learning 3D, I learned so much from these technical forums, just because they just have so many great stickies on technical information. Obviously, it can seem overwhelming just how many threads there really are, but they're great places to ask technical questions, getting things that are not working, you're not sure. And then also to kind of just find cool little tech things. There's this one that's just how to model kind of cool shapes, these hard surface shapes. And so people kind of go over how they kind of go about modeling them and everything. Let's see if there's any examples of people showing off anything. Unfortunately, not right now. I guess everyone's just kind of asking questions on it. But depending on whatever you are kind of really interested in, it has a lot of really great technical talks in here. There's also a Substance one, an Unreal one as well. So I would say just the Polycount forums in general are just a really big benefit to have, and it can get your name out there as well. And again, in this day and age where there's just so many people, there are so many people that are trying to get into the industry or trying to get a better job in the industry. The more your name is kind of known, obviously in a positive light, the better chance you are to get multiple offers or any offers in just at all. I know some amazingly talented artists. They are probably some of the best texture artists I've ever seen. However, they never post their work online just because they don't really care, and they're like, cool, I'm happy where I'm at Blizzard or at Infinity Ward or at Naughty Dog, and they're just like, I'm just never going to post my work because I don't care. They're not looking to kind of go to a new job at all. However, I know people who are, let's just say it for lack of a better turn of phrase, they're just not as talented or even remotely as talented, but they're far more well known just because of the online presence they've built for themselves, how much they're showing off by the tutorials they make, and their or the articles that they contribute to. And I'm not to say that they're like bad artists at all in any such stretch of the imagination. They're still definitely good artists, but being well known is oftentimes a lot more valuable than even just being the best. Because if you're the best but nobody knows who you are, then are you really the best? Because then just nobody knows it. But if you are a really good artist and you're just extremely well known because you're posting a lot on places like Polycount, like ArtStation, you're trying to contribute to other avenues as much as possible, then that's just going to help build up your brand as much as possible. Okay, and then the final thing I wanted to leave everyone with is let's say you get past the interview phase. You get to, or you're in the interview phase itself. You got a studio to like you and they're like, cool, we want to like kind of interview, and you're trying to figure out or you're trying to get the job there. Now, one of the biggest common mistakes I see a lot of people do is that they don't often interview the studio that they're working for. And so what that means is when you are taking an interview, when you are taking an art test, you have to remember that an interview is always a kind of back and forth. It's a two-way street. The studio is trying to find out if you are the right fit for them, but you also should be finding out if the studio is the right fit for you. Because not every studio is the same. Some studios are way more kind of just kind of like work. That's all we kind of do here. As soon as the day's over, people just go home and then that's it. And some people really like that. Some people hate it. There are other studios that they have a much better kind of culture at their studio. They promote kind of being kind of friendly with their coworkers, kind of excelling outside of just kind of work and everything. And just getting to the point where you have like a really nice kind of friendly kind of working atmosphere. And so all studios are different. And so you really want to find the one that kind of really fits for you, because the amount of people that I've spoken to that have gone through either, that have gone through the interview process, gotten a job somewhere, they've worked there for a few months, and then they realize that they hate actually working at what they thought was their dream studio. And that's because they don't actually interview the studio that they're working for. They are not asking about what it's like to work there, what kind of the company culture's like, what the expectations are for them as an artist, which I think is the most important thing to really ask and really figure out. Like, what is the studio's expectations for you as an artist? If you're someone who really wants to grow as an artist or grow into a leadership position someday, you're going to want to ask about those things. Ask about like, what is kind of the growth opportunities that are at a studio? What are the ways that the studio is going to help you become a better artist, and in turn you help the studio become obviously a better studio? These are all things you want to ask, because we've had tons of people who started at Naughty Dog and then after a few months they quit because they just really don't like the kind of company culture that we have, or possibly the lack of company culture at the studio. I've had other people who have worked at studios that they just didn't like the more lax nature of kind of the studio, the more kind of, I guess, a friendly atmosphere, I guess is the word for it. But just some people just prefer to kind of go to work their hours, and then go home. Some people like to kind of interact more with their coworkers outside of work, or have the studio essentially help facilitate things. So it doesn't just feel like, oh, I'm just working this job. I'm 9 to 5. I'm a cog in the machine. Some people like it when the studio promotes that kind of more togetherness. So it's something you really gotta kind of really figure out, because eventually you're gonna get to the point where you are going to be crunching. And that is something you also want to ask about, is you want to ask about what their crunch essentially mentality is, or kind of what their stance on it is. Because every studio you ever go to probably will tell you, oh, we try to minimize crunch, or we don't crunch at all. And if they do, that's just a complete lie. Every studio crunches. Maybe there's like 3 or 4 out there that actually don't, but pretty much every studio crunches. It just depends. Does the studio crunch for a few days a week, a few weeks, a month, or 9 months? Those are things you got to find out, because some studios do crunch for 9 months, just week on week, day on day. You're just pretty much crunching. And some studios are like, yeah, no, we just maybe work a few extra hours every week. So you really want to kind of figure out what the studio does, because crunch is really difficult on a lot of people. It definitely can burn you out really quickly. It can be really hard on you in terms of just your mental well-being and stress. Obviously, I think it's not a good thing, but I don't think it's something that is going away from the industry for quite a while. So you want to find out what their kind of position on crunch is like. If they ever expect you to kind of like work on weekends, what happens if you decide not to crunch? Just because, even right now, I have a friend whose game is coming out later this year. And, when they started on the project, he never really asked about crunch, because he's like, oh, well, he's like, I don't work weekends ever. He's like, I'm just not going to do it. But he never really asked about like what the studio's crunch schedule was like. And so now that they're in the middle of crunch, the studio pretty much was like, hey, your essentially job kind of future at this studio depends on you crunching and coming in on the weekends. And he definitely wasn't prepared for that. He didn't think that the studio crunched like that, but that's because he didn't really ask. Now he's kind of stuck in that difficult situation where he's like, well, I don't want to crunch on the weekends, but I don't want to, essentially jeopardize his future employment at the studio, because he really likes working there, but he doesn't want to crunch. And so that's one thing he kind of realized that he regretted not figuring out more within his interview. He didn't really interview them as much. He kind of just was like, yes, I want this job. Please hire me. It should be essentially the studio being like, all right, why should we give you this job? And then you in turn, obviously not in these words, but like, why should I accept this job? You want to figure out why you want to work there, or why the studio wants you to work there. Because again, never look at it as just a one-way street. Like they're gracing you with this opportunity to work there. No, they are looking for people to hire. So you want to make sure that you are finding the right studio, finding a place that's going to value you as an employee, and their ideals and their values are in line with yours. Because again, even your dream studio that you're like, oh, I would love to work there because I love the projects they work on. Sometimes those just don't work out. Like sometimes they are the worst places to work because they just clash with your type of personality. So figuring out how it is, how the work structure is, how you work with other members of the team. Because again, in the video game industry, every studio kind of structures their teams differently. There's no set standard. So the way an environment artist works at Naughty Dog could be very different than the way an environment artist works at, like, say, Rockstar or Infinity Ward. At Naughty Dog, you obviously have a ton of artistic control over things. And whereas at like Infinity Ward, the designer has essentially a lot more artistic control than the environment artist, just because the design of those maps, especially for the multiplayer, is just so important. So you have to be like, okay, I know I have to sacrifice some things artistically that I want to do to make sure that design-wise, this is so much more or so much stronger. You're always going to have to sacrifice some of your your art for that, but how much into like kind of what degree, and figuring out kind of how you would work and interact with those different teams at a given studio is really important. So definitely kind of think about what it is you want out of the studio and kind of where you are really going in terms of, or where you're going in terms of kind of like your life path and like what you want out of it and what you want out of the studio that you're applying for. Because if you're a good artist and you can show that you have the abilities, unless you live somewhere where there's just like no opportunities, generally you'll find an opportunity eventually. I've never met a talented artist that only ever got the first job that was ever offered them, or the first kind of like position. If you're good enough and you just like kind of apply enough, eventually that right position will come around. So just answer this last question here. Clarence asks, have you ever thought about working outside of the US in the future? So yeah, I definitely have thought about it quite a lot, just because I love to travel, especially to kind of like Europe and everything. I've been there quite a few times now, just obviously because there's also just a lot of countries that are just so densely packed into Europe. But at least for right now, like I love the studio that I work for. I love the fact that I work with so many of my extremely close friends. So I'm super lucky about that. And then as someone who's originally from San Diego, which is basically just 2 hours south of LA, where Naughty Dog is located, I've always just loved living by the beach and in California. Though it is hard to think about leaving that, but you never know. I do love the idea of possibly maybe working in like Amsterdam someday. I know Gorilla has a really nice studio out there, or in Japan, because I think, I've been to Japan before and it seems like an amazing place to kind of live and just be. And just, there's so many great studios around the world. And yeah, it would be really cool to kind of just travel and, work somewhere else outside of the US, get that experience that I get when, that broadens your horizons when you travel, that I get when I travel, but to do it for kind of like an entire game, or, a few years and maybe a few projects. Yeah, that's definitely something that's extremely appealing to me, but it's one of those things where it's always hard to balance that when you're working on something that you're super passionate about and you don't want to kind of leave. And so it can be difficult as well to kind of be like, oh, I'm going to kind of, I guess, uproot and leave. But yeah, it's not something I'll rule out, and it's definitely something that I always keep in the back of my mind, especially once a project ships. That's another thing, is just every time a project ships, I think everyone, you're kind of decompressing from the game, especially crunch. And you always just kind of want to reevaluate kind of where you are in the industry, in life. If you want to kind of move out, kind of check out things, and kind of just go and explore. And I think that's a good time to kind of improve your skills. Like some people take this class or some of the other classes and just kind of be like, okay, now I want to maybe go try a different job and, maybe live in a different country for a little while. It's always a really cool option. And yes, Clarence, Sweden's gaming industry is definitely picking up. There are, as River mentioned as well, there are a bunch of studios kind of popping up in China as well. Like there's a Ubisoft Shanghai studio as well. One of my previous students just got a job there in December as well. So there's lots of international places that are really cool and really appealing to kind of want to like go and work and then just get to really inundate yourself in that type of culture. So always really exciting. But obviously just, kind of uprooting your life can be also terrifying. But just from all the international people that we have at Naughty Dog, a lot of people have made that kind of leap, and that I haven't really run into anyone that's ever regretted kind of moving to a different country to try out a new job. Most people have always really enjoyed it. So yeah, if you do get the chance to kind of move around, I definitely say go for it, especially if you are younger and everything. Like, it becomes way easier if you aren't tied down by like family or anything. Obviously, it becomes even more significantly easier. But yeah, definitely something I always keep in the back of my mind. All right, and with that, we will pretty much wrap up this week's live Q&A and pretty much the class here. I want to say thank you for everyone who participated in the class. It's been really great to see all your work go from the planning stages all the way to the end. Of course, keep me updated with everything that you all are kind of doing, that you're working on. If you're, kind of able to take like an art test somewhere, or if you need any advice on that when you are taking your art test, or interviewing at a studio, just let me know. I'm always there for you. You can just send me an email. I would say the one thing is, if I ever don't respond right away, just like ping me again, like if it's been like a few days or whatever, just in case, it gets lost in the emails that I have here. They generally don't tend to get lost in this, but sometimes, just because, especially right now, because at Naughty Dog, we are kind of in crazy crunch mode. Sometimes emails can get missed, or just replies not kind of sent out. So yeah, if you ever just don't hear from me, you can just totally send me a message again. Like, I don't mind it at all. Yeah, you can definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. I probably haven't updated my LinkedIn profile in probably since I started at Naughty Dog, which is definitely not a good thing. I think you should definitely keep those updated, but I just haven't. I, for the most part, try and keep my ArtStation and my portfolio updated as much as possible. As that is the main thing. But yeah, stay in touch. Love to see whatever environments you're working on in the future. If you do make any updates to the scenes you have been building over this course, also would love to see those as well. And yeah, thanks again, everyone. It's been an honor to kind of teach you and hopefully pass on as much knowledge as I can. Hope you all stay in touch.